Actually, one of the most interesting stories that happened recently was in Los Angeles with a Mr. Joe Moshe, M-O-S-H-E, which people can Google and find themselves. On Thursday, he was surrounded by a SWAT team after he had called in last week to Dr. Truott's show on Republic Broadcasting and called in asking if there was a state's attorney or someone he could give evidence to, because he was apparently a biological scientist with a dual citizenship in Israel. And he had evidence that the Baxter had a Ukraine lab actually not making a vaccine but making a bioweapon that was going to cause a plague when the vaccine was released. So the next day, a SWAT team, literally an army, surrounded his Volkswagen Beetle in West Los Angeles. They hit his car 4 times with pepper cannons, and then they sent in a robot after he just sat in the car, and apparently they were surprised that he didn't kind of cough and choke and come out. They sent in a robot to break a back window, and they tasered him and hauled him out through the windows. Apparently, because of his dual citizenship, he got extradited to Israel, and we haven't heard from him since. There are 2 major news reports out of West Los Angeles that they literally surrounded him with an army. They hit his vehicle with a microwave EMP pulse machine to actually not only disable the ignition, but also knock out any electronics he had to transmit, because they tried to claim in the news article he threatened the President Obama, and he didn't do any of the sort. What he did actually is he called in and said, I have new information, because I'm a biological scientist, that they are planning on releasing the Baxter vaccine made in the Ukraine that will be shipped to America, and it's going to contain lethal genes that will cause the death of millions. And he asked Truott on the air if he could get a contact for a state's attorney. He was on his way to the Israeli embassy at the time, which is near the FBI offices in Los Angeles, and the FBI surrounded him with literally an army with the active denial system, microwave tanks, robots. They tasered him and everything. I mean, there's something going on here where we have whistleblowers coming out that are basically telling us, hey, they are going to release they're not just satisfied with the virus mutating and recombining, either becoming less or more lethal. They want to tweak it along to make sure that it's lethal enough they can declare martial law, which is what the government's pushing for. Because parallel with this, they want to have a bank holiday, they want to revalue the U.S. currency, and they want to switch over to the Amero note sometime in the next 6 to 12 months so that they can form the trade zone of North America.
Our understanding is that the Amero is no longer, that's actually defunct, and they're going with another kind of currency.
They might. Whatever they're calling the currency they're going to go with, they're going to do a tremendous devaluation of the U.S. dollar. What I have from my sources is that they're going to devalue it sometime in one of these waves. It could be this fall or winter, but they're getting ready to do that, and they want to have the cover, of course, of a plague occurring at the same time to quell the population, because there's going to be a lot of resistance.
Tragic irony here is that Professor Malcolm Casadobán had been trying to develop a vaccine so that thousands of people around the world wouldn't die a painful, ugly death from a bacterial infection related to the plague. But it was that bacterium that appears to have killed him.
60-year-old Malcolm Casadobán was a professor of molecular genetics at the University of Chicago for 30 years. For the past 8 years, his daughters say he'd been working with a strain of bacteria called Yersinia pestis, trying to develop a stronger vaccine for the plague. The weakened strain he was using, however, isn't supposed to make healthy people sick. And that is the big mystery now for investigators with the Centers for Disease Control and the state and city public health departments.
Was it a change in the organism? Was there something about the person who was affected that made him uniquely susceptible? We don't really know the answers to that yet.
It was hurtful just because we remember our father was very healthy.
Brooke and Lee Casadobán say they're not satisfied with the answers they've been given so far. How did their father, who had flu-like symptoms, enter the hospital a week ago Sunday morning and die 12 hours later with no one suspecting that it could be related to the plague?
The reason pneumonic plague hasn't been more of a problem in the past is that in its natural form, it can't live long in air and sunlight.
This pathogen is not very stable in aerosol environment. But the Soviet military, they developed a weapon which was more stable in aerosol.
Dr. Ken Alibek is the former first deputy director of the Soviet Offensive Bioweapons Program. He moved to this country in 1992, and he now heads George Mason's University Center for Biodefense. While he was a Soviet scientist, he and his comrades had worked to make a bulletproof version of Yersinia pestis.
And I would say by mid-80s, they were able to develop a plague with resistance to many different antibiotics.
Dr. Alibek and his colleagues are trying to learn how to protect against such genetically armored superbugs. He thinks the effectiveness of current antibiotics would be limited.
When we talk about possible use of genetically engineered pathogens, it's a completely different situation. You cannot use antibiotics because in many cases they wouldn't work.
Research on new vaccines is underway, but Dr. Alibek believes there are just too many varieties of bioweaponry for vaccine development to be practical and affordable. His group is working on a different approach.
We call this approach immunomodulating approach. And the general idea to find some ways to modulate, to enhance non-specific immunity of the body, and just to induce it such a way that the immune system would be able to eliminate these inviting pathogens by itself.
Even if it's only temporary, this could protect military personnel going into a hazardous area and strengthen the immune response of civilians to fight off a biological attack. Eventually, better knowledge of the plague germ should also help. Towards that end, a project is underway at the Sanger Institute in England, where earlier this year scientists broke the plague's genetic code. And at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, scientists study how bacteria behave. The plague is a model organism. One startling discovery was that the plague had once been a harmless microbe, living more or less peacefully in the gut, until sometime between 2,000 and 20,000 years ago, when it turned into a killer, all at once.
Yersinia pestis is fascinating to study because historically it has shaped Western civilization. It has caused so many deaths, and it's fascinating to study that, to try to work out how it did that, what makes this organism tick. And we're beginning to understand that at the genetic level now with the genome sequence. We clearly know it's gained a lot of DNA that's made it more adaptable, more transmissible, more virulent. It's gone through this process of mixing its DNA around.
These scientists saw the story unfold in the sequencing of the plague genome. It's a bit like reading a genetic history book. Although the plague still kills about 3,000 people every year, it's been largely controlled by antibiotics. But the production of weaponized antibiotic-resistant strains has raised the threat to a whole new level. This new DNA technology may make it possible to screen for these bulletproof pathogens as we devise a defense against them.
It could be an alert. One of the potential applications of this is for bioterrorist agents. For example, if someone had altered the genome of a highly pathogenic organism for nefarious purposes, we should potentially be able to not just identify the organism, but identify whether that bioterrorist group has cloned in any of these really nasty genes, because they're also on this array.
Today, other bacteria are emerging which show many of the same traits and behaviors as a plague pathogen. Scientists fear that one of them could cause a disaster comparable to the Black Death of medieval times. Today, the possibility of new killer pathogens and the weaponizing of old ones has given a new urgency to the search for biological protection.
Well, as we can see, Alexei, the virus is spreading in Ukraine. But what about the people? What do they think about the situation? Is there a sense of panic among them?
Yes, that's what we feel here in the Ukrainian capital. I'd like to remind that 9 regions of Ukraine remain under quarantine. This includes Kiev. All schools and universities have been closed till further notice. That could be about 3 weeks, and people are here on the ground are starting to panic. Over the weekend they have swept all the anti-flu medication off the shelves of drugstores. Respiratory masks, which also were available on Friday and Thursday, also cannot be found now in Kiev, even though every third person in the streets of Kiev is wearing those masks. At the same time, people, as I mentioned, do not know what to expect of this outbreak. over 180,000 people across the country have been diagnosed with different respiratory diseases, and the situation seems to be really, really serious for the time being.